Global warming is forecast to have a catastrophic effect on weather all over the planet. And this will place extreme pressure on the world's natural resources.
If our predictions are correct, by the year 2025, water will really become the most critical issue for human survival.
To try and combat these effects, experts are increasingly turning to weather modification techniques, such as cloud seeding.
We can make a change within cloud systems to produce more rain for drinking water, for agriculture. That makes a tremendous difference.
In the future, weather modification could even be used to tackle the growing threat of superstorms.
We might be able to prevent or reduce vulnerability to serious hurricanes by controlling the storm, by reducing its intensity, by steering it out to sea. I don't think it would take very many years to come up with a technology.
But while there are clear humanitarian reasons for wanting to manipulate the weather, there is also a dark history behind previous attempts to do so. The British, Russian, and American governments have all conducted top-secret weather modification projects, sometimes with disastrous consequences.
Military planners imagined loading the clouds with radiological, biological, or chemical agents and having them rain on demand. We had opened this Pandora's box of evil, and we really didn't know where it would lead us to.
For the first time, some of those actively involved have agreed to talk.
The area where my crew was actively influencing the clouds was near Chernobyl.
In this program, we investigate the potential benefits and the appalling consequences of attempting to control the weather. Dr. Rolf Brunjes is one of the world's leading authorities on weather modification. He's been conducting research in this area for more than 20 years.
Flying an aircraft between clouds, you feel very small, and trying to explore and trying to understand what is happening inside clouds is one of the greatest challenges.
Dr. Brunjes' expertise is in demand all over the world for one very good reason. He can make it rain. A rapidly growing population coupled with global warming means that water is increasingly set to become the world's most precious commodity. One of the solutions to this problem can be found within clouds.
An average rain cloud contains about 8 million tons of rainwater, and therefore there's a vast quantity of untapped fresh water in the sky, and this is where cloud seeding comes in, to address the growing needs for water around the world.
Most rainmaking techniques used today originated back in 1946, when scientists discovered that by dropping particles of a chemical called silver iodide into cloud tops, they could trigger rainfall. Since then, countries all over the world have experimented with different ways to squeeze rain out of the clouds. China spends more on cloud seeding than any other country in the world.
I'll put the radar on here in the aircraft so you can find out the distance to that cell band. Yeah, if you can see what the distance is, that would be...
Dr. Brunjes is in Mali, West Africa, to test out a new technique he's devised with colleagues at the National Centre for Atmospheric Research. It involves the use of pyrotechnic flares to deliver a special seeding material into the base of a cloud.
These are the so-called hygroscopic flares. They consist of salts inside. And as we burn them, the smoke produces the particles, the salt particles, that will then be taken up into the cloud and participate in the rain formation.
Once released into the cloud's updraft, each one of the hygroscopic salt particles becomes a seed around which a single water droplet can form. These droplets collide with each other and grow, eventually becoming heavy enough to fall out of the cloud as rain.
Oh, there's a rainbow up front here.
Weather modification today is an increasingly precise science which can reap huge benefits for the many countries that suffer from severe water shortages.
In the last few years, we've literally been on all 5 continents. A lot of our work focused on Southeast Asia, Africa, North and South America, and then also in Europe, Italy and Greece. There are currently more than 47 countries, more than 150 programs, cloud seeding programs, going on as we speak.
Ron, you can go back.
Cloud seeding seems to be making a change for the better for many people in the world today. But it's a science that is born out of a murky and troubled past.
Tragedy, sudden and appalling, descends upon the little seaside resort of Lynmouth.
In 1952, a freak storm destroyed a sleepy Devonshire village.
This was the main street of Lynmouth only a few days ago.
The storm led to catastrophic flooding that destroyed the town and killed 35 people. It was the most destructive storm in British history. But was it a natural one? Within days of the catastrophe, there were rumours of secret experiments. Rumours which the Met Office and the Ministry of Defence flatly denied. Then a witness came forward. A glider pilot, Alan Yates, now deceased, told a BBC journalist that just prior to the Lynmouth flood, he had taken part in a government-sponsored cloud seeding experiment.
We'd assembled at Cranfield in Bedfordshire in mid-August 1952, studying clouds. On the day I'm recalling, the weather was superb, but the cotton wool cumulus clouds were growing everywhere, and it was decided to make them rain.
Yates told the journalist that he and his colleagues had seeded clouds over the Bedfordshire countryside and had witnessed the effects for themselves.
I circled down between the clouds, still doggedly noting temperature, height, time, and the rest. Eventually, far below, I saw a sodden-looking countryside. Toasts were drunk to meteorology. They'd certainly made it rain.
Recently declassified documents have confirmed that the experiment, codename Operation Cumulus, took place in the first 2 weeks of August and coincided with the heaviest rainfall in Bedfordshire for many years. The experiment was heralded as a resounding success, until the rain continued to spread west, across the country, and into Devon. More than 50 years after the event, it is impossible to say if cloud seeding really did trigger the most destructive storm in British history, or if it was just an unfortunate coincidence. What is clear is that the government, anxious not to be blamed, closed the project down and denied it had ever taken place. decade after the Lynmouth disaster, research on cloud seeding was to continue, this time in the United States, with Project Storm Fury.
Project Storm Fury assembles a team of highly trained scientists and technicians to fly into mature hurricanes.
They were hoping to use the technology to weaken hurricanes. What the Storm Fury scientists didn't realize, however, was that their research had caught the eye of the military. Dr. Joanne Simpson was one of the pioneers of Project Storm Fury. She was to find out only much later that the military were developing her techniques and using them as a weapon of war.
I thought it was terrible. I mean, all my life I've tried to work for the betterment of the planet and the people, even in a small way, and then to use what I've done as some kind of a military thing, I obviously am very concerned and not happy about it.
At that time, the United States Army were in Vietnam, struggling against the Viet Cong, an elusive guerrilla army. The Pentagon were desperate to explore anything that might give them an edge. So when military planners suggested that cloud seeding might trigger massive downpours and flood the Viet Cong's main supply routes, the government were quick to respond. Pierre Saint-Amand was part of the team assembled in a top-secret cloud seeding operation known simply as Project Popeye.
The main purpose of Project Popeye was to demonstrate that cloud seeding would actually increase the rainfall on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So by making the trail more muddy and trafficability difficult, we were hoping to keep people out of the fight.
The Ho Chi Minh Trail was of key strategic importance to the Viet Cong, the route along which vital weapons and supplies were transported. In May 1967, as monsoon clouds developed over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, Amand and his team put their new weapon to the test.
We had 2 Cedar aircraft, and then we usually had a Marine fighter pilot laying alongside of us to keep the bad guys from shooting us down. We ejected the material so that it fell into the growing part of the cloud.
The results were spectacular.
The first one we seeded grew like an atomic bomb explosion, and it rained very heavily out of it, and everybody was convinced with that one experiment that we'd had done enough.
Having witnessed the success of this experiment, the military now began to dream of more radical and extreme uses to which the technology could be applied.
Imagine a weapon that could affect the entire planet, and yet you could launch an attack against an enemy and they wouldn't even know it. Military planners imagined loading the clouds with radiological, biological, or chemical agents and having them rain on demand. Some said, if you control the weather, you can control the world.
The belief was that you could attack your enemy using the weather, but deny ever doing so. Experiments in Vietnam continued for 5 years until in 1972, a leak from the White House blew the cover on Project Popeye. allegations were made that cloud seeding had not only made jungle paths impassable, it had also killed thousands of innocent people.
When Project Popeye was revealed in the press, it caused an immediate firestorm of criticism. People were concerned at the time that we had opened this Pandora's box of evil, and we really didn't know where it would lead us to.
Project Popeye had opened the door to a new and dangerous type of warfare. The firestorm it created led to an international treaty banning all use of weather modification for military purposes. But this didn't stop governments from continuing to explore ways of modifying the weather, sometimes for highly questionable purposes. For decades, the Soviet Union seeded clouds before they reached Moscow in order to prevent rainfall on their big military parades. Harmless enough? But evidence has recently come to light that the Soviet authorities also used this technology for something much more sinister, the effects of which are still being felt today. 26th of April 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine exploded, spewing hundreds of tons of radioactive material into the atmosphere and creating the most horrific nuclear disaster in history. In 1992, Dr. Alan Flowers was one of the first Western scientists allowed into the area to examine the extent of the radioactive fallout around Chernobyl. He was working in Gomel, in the Republic of Belarus, in a region that lies between Chernobyl and Moscow.
I was with my research group measuring levels of radioactivity in the soils and also the levels of radiation dose that the population were exposed to. And we found, even 5 years after the Chernobyl accident, the population were still being subjected to levels of dose 20 to 30 times higher than normal environmental radiation levels.
Many children in Belarus were showing the effects of intense radiation poisoning. But how was this possible so far from the reactor?
We would not normally expect, at a distance of 150 to 200 kilometers, such high levels of radioactivity, unless, of course, there had been some very unusual and intense rain.
Following the explosion, there was a buildup of heavily radioactive rain clouds above Chernobyl. The prevailing winds threatened to blow these radioactive clouds towards Russia and the major cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg. But the rain never reached these cities. Instead, bouts of very heavy rain fell on the southeastern corner of Belarus, the same area that Dr. Flowers revealed to be showing unusually high levels of radioactivity. Disturbingly, many eyewitnesses claimed that the rainfall was caused by cloud seeding.
One of our colleagues told us about the Sunday immediately after Chernobyl, when he drove back from the city of Gomel in very heavy rain and noticing aeroplanes in the sky with colored materials coming out and trailing them.
Есть свидетельства населения, которое зафиксировало.
There were eyewitnesses that saw the planes. And after the planes had passed, the black rainfall started.
Были черные дожди.
Dr. Zion Pazhniak, a Belarusian scientist and politician, is convinced that to save Moscow, the Soviet authorities deliberately rained out radioactive material on Belarus and openly accused them of doing so. Today, he lives in exile.
I can speak freely about anything I want now, though I know if I ever go back to Belarus, I'll be killed. I know that.
Dr. Pazhniak believes that people in his country were sacrificed to prevent the disaster spreading elsewhere.
They were afraid that the clouds would move to the Russian region, and there would be a possibility of rainfall over Moscow or St. Petersburg. That's why they decided to rain out the clouds on the heads of the people of Belarus.
The Moscow authorities denied that cloud seeding had taken place after the accident. However, last year, at the 20th anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster, among those honored for their bravery was a pilot called Major Alexei Grushin. The award he received was for cloud seeding operations during the Chernobyl cleanup.
I am proud to say that I took part in the operations back in 1986. My comrades are proud as well. The area where my crew was actively influencing the clouds was near Chernobyl, not only in the 30-kilometer zone, but out to a distance of 50, 70, even 100 kilometers. The plane was equipped with artillery shells, which were filled with a seeding material, silver iodide. And we were following orders from the ground regarding which zones we were required to seed. The wind direction was moving from west to east, and the radioactive clouds were threatening to reach the highly populated areas of Moscow, Voronezh, Nizhny Novgorod and Yaroslavl. If the rain had fallen on those cities, it would have meant a catastrophe for millions.
During this cleanup operation, Major Grushin, his crew, and his plane were heavily exposed to radiation.
Once we landed at the airport, I was ordered to park my plane in a separate place. People came from upwind towards us. They were dressed in anti-radiation outfits and held devices to measure radiation. They reached the plane, and a few seconds later, their devices recorded such high radiation that it made them turn around and run away. The plane was highly contaminated. We were given a place in the airport where nobody was parked, neither planes, no equipment, no people.
The ruins of the Chernobyl power plant stayed highly radioactive for long after the explosion. And Major Grushin said he and others continued to conduct cloud seeding missions months after the blast. Another Russian pilot, who does not wish to be identified, has since confirmed that cloud seeding operations took place as early as 2 days after the explosion. Were the actions of the Soviet authorities justified? Clearly, they faced a terrible dilemma.
You are faced with the fact that a radioactive cloud is there in the sky. That radioactive cloud and the radioactive material in it is going to fall down somewhere. It is going to fall on a human population somewhere. So if you are in Moscow, you have a very difficult decision to make. Do you let nature take its course, and that may then result in this cloud falling on millions and millions of people in Moscow? Or do you intervene? And do you use the technical resources that you have and try to minimize the number of population that this cloud will affect.
The trouble was, the secrecy which surrounded events at Chernobyl meant that the Belarusian people were completely unaware of the coming rain.
The local population talk about how there was absolutely no warning before these heavy rains and the radioactive fallout arrived. Now, if somebody in Moscow knew that there was going to be artificial fallout created in this area, it would have been quite possible to mitigate against that by warning the population to stay indoors, by distributing potassium iodide tablets. It is quite clear that these actions did not take place.
The high levels of radiation found in Belarus have led to dramatic increases in leukemia, thyroid cancers, and child defects.
I had lots of friends in the area where the cloud seeding took place. They had to move away from their homes, and their children became ill. Thyroid cancer has increased amongst children by 50 times in the area where the cloud seeding took place. If there had been no cloud seeding, there would be no radiation. Even if the radiation had reached that far, it would never have been on such a huge scale. They decided to keep the cloud seeding quiet. They thought that the public would never find out about it. Everything would stay a secret and nobody would need to take responsibility.
If you choose to intervene in a weather system, there are immense ethical considerations. One of the moral pitfalls would be trying to stop a disaster from happening in one place, but actually causing a disaster elsewhere. The unintended damage, in other words, may be worse than the kind of damage you're trying to prevent. The weather is essentially a very chaotic system. And while it may be predictable in very short time periods, in many cases there could be surprises. There's all sorts of unknowns.
In next week's program, we look at how the science of weather modification is being developed in order to defend major cities from the growing threat of superstorms.
Today's Premiership highlights coming up in Match of the Day 2 next, and then Graham Norton Uncut with guests including Barbara Windsor at 11:20.